Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are. I'm Ira Feldman. I am the Executive Director of MEPTEC. I would like to welcome you to today's MEPTEC IMAPS Semiconductor Industry Speaker Series. So welcome, thank you for joining us. In the series, our next presentation will be on September 9th. Brandon Pryor from Prismark Partners will give us an overview of the packaging market. As always, excellent presentation. We will take the month of August off, but we will start on September 9th, where we'll have two presentations a month scheduled. The webinar start at 11:30 a.m. Pacific and run approximately 1 hour. If you're interested in speaking at a future webinar or luncheon, please contact myself or Dave Town, and we'd be happy to discuss the particulars with you. So we're always looking for additional presentations. And then in terms of saving the date, the Known Good Die workshop is now a virtual event. It will be September 16th to 18th online. We will be posting the agenda next week, but the website will be updated as soon as that is ready. We have an exciting keynote from David Greenlaw of NVIDIA and technical presentations from Cisco, Advantest, Synopsys, Mulbauer, and others. So please join us for the Known Good Die workshop, September 16th, 17th, and 18th. They'll be held as approximately 2-hour daily virtual sessions. So we're looking forward to that. And then in terms of MEPTEC, just a reminder, memberships and sponsorships enable us to produce events such as this webinar and put them out there for free or very low cost. So your support of us helps us to continue to generate excellent content. So please take a moment to either join as a member, renew, or explore a corporate membership. And you can address your questions on this to Betty B. Cooper at meptec.org. So please support us. So today's Semiconductor Industry Speaker Series, it's my pleasure to introduce Raul Perez from Digital Papaya. He's going to be talking about system custom silicon development process. In terms of background, Raul has over 20 years of experience doing, last count, probably over 40 IC designs into production. At Apple in particular, he ramped over 18 designs into high volume for the iPhone and iPad in a very short period of time. So there's certainly many challenges to doing that effectively. And his background is in analog processor development, and certainly has done a lot of work on PMIX in particular. And he's CustomSilicon.com, works with IC design teams across the globe. And with that, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Raul.
Thank you, Ira. Appreciate your time, and thanks for having me here at the MEPTEC IMAPS Semiconductor Industry Speaker Series. The topic I'll be covering will be the custom silicon development process from a system perspective, and I'll go in. Okay, so a lot of companies today are differentiating their products with system silicon that's developed specifically for them. And so initially, a lot of companies might think that that actually is very expensive. And it could be very expensive if you're shipping in very low volume. But when you actually do the numbers and you actually understand what your shipping volume will be, it turns out that for people that are shipping in good enough volume, they'll be able to save quite a lot. So when I make the statements on this slide, I'm thinking about, in terms of return on investment, I'm thinking about the people that are usually selling consumer electronics, and they're shipping in the at least single-digit millions. But it depends what silicon you're buying today. If it's really expensive, then the numbers might be lower. So the typical number that I've seen when people go from discrete components to high volume custom silicon is about a 50% reduction in cost. Considering silicon, you can also create, or just opportunities which might be, Z diode, things that might are in terms of reduction the area, it can still cover about 50% reduction in your product that you care about that or not. Certainly on wearables and things like cell phones, this is very critical since you're in any battery device, right? You're basically trading off your volume, and so you can spend it on electronics or you can spend it on more battery. And so most people want to spend it on more battery. So this is one way you can shrink your design and then get better battery life at the same time. Usually you can also get better performance. So you start winning on all those counts. In terms of like differentiation, a lot of companies have, you have your patents, your firmware algorithm that you want to protect. There's also safety considerations, but when it's very easy for certain companies out there, which I can name a few, which I'm not going to do here, but they'll reverse engineer your entire firmware, and they'll also reverse engineer your entire PCB. And if they really, really want to spend the money, they can delayer, your entire everything that's on your board, even your custom silicon potentially. So you have to really then protect yourself from that. And custom silicon is an easy way of doing that. You can do things like encrypt and decrypt images of firmware that get loaded to your system, so that way nobody can really reverse engineer your firmware algorithm, and nobody can tamper with it after you ship. And then also you can like do things in the custom silicon to protect your design even from delayering. So when you go custom, you really basically obscure your IP, and then your patented ideas are much easier to implement because you're getting exactly what you want, instead of having to buy perhaps like a chipset that's been designed with a broad market in mind, and you end up with stuff on your board that you can't really use, but you have to because you need to use a chipset, and they're not going to write software just for you. So that's that's the third point. In terms of IP protection, like I mentioned, you can obscure your design. And just to go back and like explain exactly what custom silicon is. Custom silicon is, as opposed to off-the-shelf components, the kind of components that you can buy in DigiKey from many suppliers, that they're designed with a broad market in mind, and therefore they're not optimized for your application. Their objective is to give people the tools and the system companies to make their designs, and they're by definition they need to be broad market, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to make enough revenue off of those. So custom silicon is as opposed to that.
Well, where do FPGAs fit into this? Is there some more modest volume applications where an FPGA might actually make more sense than custom silicon? They give you some of the advantages without having to deal with all the discretes.
Yeah, well, I mean, usually FPGAs come to play at least in the custom silicon framework as an initial tool for the firmware engineers to develop the image so that they're ready when the silicon comes in. They tend to be more expensive. So I don't know, it would have to be fairly low volume in my experience for somebody to want to ship with that, but you can. And there's also potential reasons why you want to do that, because you can do the parallel processing on an FPGA. And if your application really needs that, I mean, that makes sense for you. So certainly, they're definitely a useful tool, whether you're shipping in mass production or you're using them to get to, your firmware guys ready, so that when the build starts with your custom silicon, they have something they can work with. Sometimes it's not that easy to map the RTL into an FPGA so it can become a distraction when you're working on developing an FPGA for your firmware guys to work on while doing custom silicon. So it's a little bit of a two-edged sword, but yeah, it is useful, certainly. In terms of design cycles, generally, if you look at a custom silicon product, if you were just going to go and start it from scratch, the first stage is usually developing the base IP, and that's one design cycle. You do test chips. And then the second cycle is you take those test chips, you modify them to the specific requirements. And now that IP is silicon proven, you have a much more manageable level of risk, and you can execute quicker and have a good chance of success. Now, there's multiple ways of doing this. But in general, what you need to do is, you need to review your supplier capabilities, whether your supplier is an established semiconductor company that ships, from concept to mass production, they take care of all of it. Or if you're working with IP suppliers, and then you're going to integrate, and you're hiring a design company, a chip design company, to go and take those IPs, integrate them into a chip for you, and then they're going to make the modifications. You really have to be really, really careful, and really have expert reviewers to check that base IP is good, is valid, and it's good, verified. Then you also have to, like, on the system side, you need to make sure that your engineers you have the right people, the right stakeholders involved, and that they're all distilling their requirements to what you need, no less than what you need, but just what you need, not more than that, not a lot of bells and whistles. When you do this in a very systematic approach, what you end up with is that now you're being able to find suppliers that can provide you the IP that you need, that can execute your project, and they can execute it with the minimal amount of technical and schedule risk, because you've been diligent about distilling your requirements to what you need, and no more than that. And you can then get into, within a single design cycle, you can get your chip, so it means, like, in a single generation, you can get exactly the custom silicon you want. Some companies are able, that are basically the best in the world, right? They're writing the node. So not only are they developing custom silicon, they're developing on the cutting edge process. And so for them, it's even more to follow their sort of approach, and really carefully, and all make sure in terms of execution, to reduce your technical and schedule risk, there are some things that are important. You need to have really tight communication between all parties involved. And usually all parties involved means multiple system company engineering teams. You're talking about the software team, you're talking about firmware, you're talking about battery team, you're talking about, double E's, you're talking about multiple reliability team, etc. It depends on what your system is, right? If you have a display team, the sensor team, etc., etc. So you can imagine all these system teams, they need to be in touch with each other, and you're the single point of contact that's basically driving all the requirements, and also resolving the conflicts between them, because there might be sometimes requirements that are mutually exclusive or somewhat mutually exclusive. And then also you have suppliers, which might be in different countries usually, and different time zones. So you're basically managing a global team on top of, like, the supply chain, which is usually a foundry somewhere in Asia, packaging and test. You may or may not be managing those suppliers for wafers and packaging and test, depending on what's your development model. If you go with the tier one semiconductor companies that can go from concept to mass production, you're not going to have to deal with that. But there are some companies that don't want to do that or can't do that because the tier ones won't work with them. And then you're putting together two, tier three, basically concept and test. Now you're having to find some wafer aggregator and packaging and test house that you're going to be driving as a system company. So there's multiple ways of doing this, but in any one of those ways, you're always managing very different types of teams and multiple companies, and in all around the globe. So you have to really be on top of communication. You don't have good communication, you will go wrong. Then you have to have expert reviewers. So as a system company, you're putting all your eggs in one basket, in the sense that if you have a discrete design and you decide your next generation product needs to be a custom silicon device, well, if that custom silicon doesn't work out, you're out of luck. You're not going to be able to ship your system. And even if you miss some build, it's already going to cause a delay. So you really have to have people that are industry experts reviewing the work of the suppliers that you've hired to do the job, because you need to have an early warning. You can't just wait for the silicon to show up. And so that's why it's really important that you have that identified, like that list of experts that will get you out of a bind if your package, for example, starts having delamination issues and you don't know if it's the substrate's contaminated, if it's the stress of the package, or any, it could be something else. And so there's a lot of issues that can come up and can be pretty deadly and can take a long time. So sometimes your supplier will not be able to solve the problem, or you might not be getting the right priority at your supplier. So you really need to have your own experts to give you a good idea what's going on. And so, and basically that helps you react to those issues. So that's why the silicon development process has been kind of emerged. It's really, there's no rocket science to it. It's really a silicon industry's process adjusted by system guys that want to make silicon in a way that they can believe in. And so it's not rocket science, but it needs to be implemented, and it needs to be implemented by people who have the knowledge. The silicon management position, I think, has emerged in the industry because all these system companies are trying to deliver silicon, like a system with custom silicon in a single generation and usually in a yearly cycle. And you just couldn't play games, and you just couldn't buy off the shelf stuff. And so you had all these different constraints. And what emerged is a position where you need to have somebody that has a strong technical management skill set, strong communication, then somebody that has silicon background, and also can understand the system needs and weave a plan between two schedules that are sometimes fighting each other between silicon and system, and integrate that into the plan so that you can get to the shipping product, to the final system product. So yeah, so this is it. This is an example here of system schedule at the top, the silicon phases, which I will be going over, and then the silicon schedule at the bottom. Of course, this is super simplified schedule. It's just the highlights.
Excuse me, Raul. I know with the approaching storm, your connection is the audio quality is dropping down. Why don't we try turning off your video so that it uses the bandwidth you have just for the audio? Let's see if that improves things. Sorry about that.
No problem. Sorry about it. Yeah, we have a storm coming, as Ira mentioned.
And your toolbar, yep, your toolbar is showing again. There, yep.
Oh, okay. No problem. Okay, so here, this is just an example. And what you see at the top is a typical system schedule. There could be more or less proto builds, more or less EVT builds. There shouldn't be more DVT builds, but there usually are. And then there should be a single PVT build. And what these mean, as you're building a system, generally the proto builds are going to have a lot of concept ideas or potential spins of a product. Let's assume that you have a shipping product and now you're trying to turn it into your next generation. If you look at the silicon schedule here, you don't have a tape out until after Proto 1, and you don't have silicon until after Proto 2. So evidently, whatever you're building at Proto 1 and Proto 2 doesn't need this silicon. And basically what that means is that you're using your previous generation silicon, and you're inputting it into Proto 1 with the firmware or the software that you developed for that silicon. And then you're expecting that once you have samples here, you'll feed them to your EVT build, and you'll be able to start writing software for that new silicon, or testing it, because you should have started writing the software before you get the silicon. You'll be loading images and debugging. So these first two builds are, as you're assembling this puzzle of a system, where you might be getting this module on this date, and then the next module 2 weeks later, and you're trying to figure out how do you assemble this puzzle and keep integrating more and more software pieces and hardware pieces, and you're testing it, and you're progressing from multiple options at proto. You're trying to like down select components, down select glue, down select mechanical approaches. When you get to EVT, you should have everything that your system needs pretty much. There may be some minor things missing. I'm sorry, I just hit my laptop. There might be some missing things, but it should, like the processor should definitely be there. And the main components of your system should be here already. And that's why you call an EVT. And now you start refining your software, trying to get all the power modes in it, implemented, and all the different features, starting to refine those. Of course, you're probably iterating your ID, your physical, look of your product, you're iterating it. And you're probably iterating all sorts of different things like glue issues and other things, but you're trying to progress and down select. And so you might have multiple EVTs. It depends how much progress you make at each one. You may be adding more and delaying your schedule. But DVT is where you have a system that you think you can ship, and you're at that build going to be trying to build a slightly higher quantity than EVT, maybe 2x, and just to see if you're right that that system can be shipped. And the difference between a late EVT and a DVT should be very minor, and every change is done very judiciously. And when it comes to silicon, you're really super, super, super careful about what you're changing. Maybe you're making an OTP change for some minor adjustment, but you're really super careful. You might be spinning silicon like I show on my schedule here. That's typically somewhat of a high risk thing, but you have to do it if you're shipping in a year cycle. And so all the risk has to be very carefully managed. And then PVT is really when you take your DVT design that you've convinced yourself is good, and now you're just gonna make 10 times more or something like that, like a significantly larger quantity. And you're gonna be shipping, you're basically looking for low DPPM issues that, you know, that you may not have been able to observe at DVT. And so, and then at PVT, pretty much once you get to PVT within a short amount of time, you're gonna be going to full mass production. And that's the end of the system schedule. On the silicon phases, you have concept, requirements, spec, tape out, sign off, and then, you know, validation of the silicon. And then you're going to have a mass production release phase where you're basically signing off the silicon is good. And on the bottom here, you see, I show silicon proposal review as the first major milestone that you have with suppliers. And that basically happens during the requirements phase. And you probably have some architecture review. It's more like a technical deep dive. And as soon as you enter spec sign off, you start working with some draft spec. And before spec sign off, spec phase is complete, you're supposed to have a final specification signed off. During the process of development, you'll have, my experience is usually a couple of design reviews where you physically travel to see your supplier. And then you'll have a tape out. And you're signing off on the tape out, and I'll show you what the kind of deliverables are for tape out. And finally, you get some A0 sample, and then you have your validation happening, and you're working on ECOs and fixing bugs. And then you'll have a revision, which could be an A1, which means metal. A means base layer, so A is first base layer, B is second base layer, and then the number is metal. So it's like A0 means first metal, A1 means second metal revision. So here you might be revising base or you might be revising metal. There's a slightly bigger time depending on which one it was. And then you build into DVT your final silicon, and you'll have your MP sign off here. So for concept, you see here in the table, I'm just identifying, you know, DRI means directly responsible individual. And so I'm just like identifying who's the main person that drives this deliverable. And then who's the supporting cast of that? And then a check mark whether the supplier needs to support this or not, because the silicon process is really a system company process. So you are communicating out results of this process to the silicon supplier. You're taking deliverables in from them, but it's really a cross-functional alignment of all the system teams to make sure that your company is fully aligned into what it is that you're building and what you're telling the silicon supplier to do. So at concept, it's really high level. You'll have some target BOM costs probably coming out of your PRD saying, hey, you know, we need to make this thing for $3, right? So this starts percolating into this, and you say, well, you know, we can only spend $1 in electronics. And basically, you'll have high-level architecture. You'll be searching for IP. You'll be talking to some chip guys. You might be making a prototype with off-the-shelf components, and maybe some of those same, you know, suppliers are the ones you're going to contact. But you're basically just convincing yourself what it is that you need so that you can define high level what this chip needs to do and what will be integrated in this chip, because also integration needs to make sense with the physical reality of the board. So like, you're not going to place a charger on the opposite side from the battery and things like that. So you need to make sure that you integrate things in places that will make your routing make sense in the board and your parasitics be minimized, right? So that means different things to different people. It really depends on your form factor product, how you're, you know, what makes the most sense to integrate. So once you get through concept, you'll have a sign off here, and then you'll be at requirements. At requirements, you've already had the conversations with the suppliers that I mentioned. You've already had a little bit of back and forth with them. You kick the tires around a little bit. Now at requirements, you're going to try to refine you're going to select supplier hopefully at this stage. And you're basically going to have a much more detailed functional requirement list because you've had the chance to talk to all these guys and they already told you how crazy you are, that this thing doesn't work or that thing's easy or whatever. And so you figured out, you know, I'm crazy here, I'm fine here, what's the trade-off? And now you've refined your requirements to something that makes more sense. And you'll have, you know, your target bump cost will be more fine-tuned and you'll have a better idea what's realistic. You'll also have, you know, formal RFQs and RFIs sent out to suppliers with the, you know, with your a sheet of requirements, the functional requirements. And at some point during this phase, you'll have, you know, probably towards the end here, you'll have this silicon proposal review. And that's a super important, that might be the make it or break it moment in this whole program, because at that moment you're selecting the supplier. And the reason why that review is super, super important is because it's the first time that you've asked the supplier to put something together for you that needs to respond to your requirements, that requires them to talk to all their internal teams and to get everybody aligned on their side to pitch you something that makes sense. And you're going to show up with verification experts. You're going to show up with chip design guys. You're going to show up with your system experts, your software guy. You're going to show up with a full technical panel. And you're going to be able to like really, really check out this proposal that they're making to you. And it needs to make sense. So if you at that stage, you see that their presentation doesn't really show what you asked them to show you, they don't seem to be talking to each other. They don't seem to be, I mean, this guy proposes one thing and the other one proposes something that contradicts it, and they're all supposed to be designing the same chip. And if you start seeing that kind of stuff, you got to walk out, because that's going to be the program. That's exactly how it's going to be for the whole program. And then basically at the end of this stage, you're going to identify which is the supplier that you want to work with. And that's why I try to down select early, but down select smart, because your team is also obviously spending time on this, and because it's so thorough, it will be a lot of time. So you don't want to be having 4 guys work, 4 different companies working on your chip, and your team is now split between 4 different chip companies, just to see which one delivers the silicon that works. You really want to down select smart early so that your team can focus on working with this one company and basically give them the best chance of success, and for you to focus really, really well and make progress on your system design. The rest of the things here are basically deliverables where you're like just fine tuning, your board space, like your power budget, as the companies give you better feedback.
So Raul, since not everybody is, let's say, one of the top 3 customers or top 5 customers, when a smaller team gets engaged with like a giant like TSMC, do they get the same level of attention, or how does that usually play out in reality? I mean, a company, let's say like Apple or Qualcomm gets exactly what they want if it's possible at some price. But what are the experiences that smaller companies see?
Yeah, so smaller companies, obviously they would love to work with the tier 1s, but many times the tier 1 won't work with you. If your volume is not high enough, they won't work with you. But if your volume is not high enough, you might not want to make custom silicon anyway, unless you're working on some military thing that you need it for whatever reason. But let's say your volume is high enough, they still might not want to talk to you because you're a startup, because your volume, your shipments, history is not clear to them. They don't know you. You don't have sponsors inside the company that are going to bat to promise people, that you're going to deliver. So that's where I think that, you need, that's when you really actually need a lot more help. Like what I do is basically, if you want to engage with tier 2, tier 3, now you're really going to be kissing a lot of frogs, and you need to have people that know exactly what a frog looks like and what a good company with a lot of good potential, but that doesn't have the tier 1 status yet, looks like, so that you can go and find that one, because that's the one that's going to want to dance with you. So, and that basically is how you get to some custom silicon. And they might be that you have to actually piece it together. Might be that you have to work with some of the companies that go to just to a GDS file, and then you have to put together your other part of the puzzle, like the wafer aggregation, the assembly and test. You'll have to like get companies to do that. Companies like mine basically do that. I can, work on all that and make sure that you have that team from day one, but you have to have somebody somehow, or you hire your own guys, if you know people, you can hire your own team. But that's basically how you would do it there, because the tier ones are difficult to get to work on your stuff. But I think that you should not skip the process, because what you'll find is, if you don't do your due diligence and you end up with a frog, which is probably the most likely scenario, your system schedule will be in a free fall. You won't know when you can ship, because they might take 4 revs, they might take more, and they might also not care because you're whatever, not a big enough customer, right? And now you're gonna have to design discrete stuff again. So I think that if you're gonna do custom silicon, you need to follow the process. If you're not gonna follow the process, don't do custom silicon. That would be my advice.
Yeah. And obviously on this, you give some months roughly on this sort of hypothetical timeline. Is this sort of time scale a reasonable time scale for all comers, or is this like a aggressive time scale, or is this the time scale that a big company would get? I mean,
This is
what's sort of the
aggressive.
variability? Okay, so
Yeah.
if somebody is not, a known entity, is the time scale 2x? Even using somebody like your company? I mean, because obviously, if the vendors are not going to be jumping on top of everything immediately, what really happens to the time scale? Or what's a reasonable expectation for the time scale?
So, the time scale, it depends obviously on what, how much stuff you're integrating and how much IP they already have. Because if they have to design new stuff, if they have to design new stuff during custom silicon cycle, I would not recommend engaging with them. It's too much risk. But yeah, your time scale could be, I mean, I've been quoted time scales up to 2 years. So it's like, but it really depends on how they structure their team. So if you're doing any level of any reasonable level of integration, you need to have somebody that has verification as a separate function. You can't have companies that will say, hey, you know what, I got designers and they can do some modeling. And so what I will do is this: we'll design the schematics, and then towards the end, we start jumping off and start making models, and then we start putting together all the verification tests, and then we ship it, we tape it out. You don't want to engage with that company. Number one, the design cycle will be significantly longer. Number two, if the companies that tend to tell you that, what they're going to do is they're going to meet the cycle time, but then they're going to tape out without good verification, which means you're not going to get a chip that's in a good state. You don't know what you're going to get necessarily. It might wiggle, but it might not, but it might have 20 bugs. You don't know how much of your system level testing or development it's going to gate. So you really need to, if you want to get lower design cycle, you need to make sure that you're choosing companies that understand that verification is key. Like, there's a lot of companies out there, they think their analog guy can do everything. Don't go with those guys. You need to get people that actually have AMS and DV as a function that exists as a separate job. And that will shorten your design cycle that you can get out of them. And then it also depends on how much resource they have. So if you're piecing your own team, you might be able to jump to, to add resource. But it could be significantly longer, that's for sure. I mean, especially if you're not getting priority. So in the end of the day, there's a lot of things that need to happen here. Like, your executive team needs to go and talk to that chip company and tell them, hey, and sell them. You got to sell them. If you're not a big company, you got to sell them on why it is that your company is the right customer that they need to engage with. But yeah, certainly you can, but there are things that you can do to make sure that your cycle time is not crazy or super long. And there are some checkpoints, like the verification one, I think is the main. I think that's where the boys and the men are split today. Like, you got guys that have strong verification and they're winning in the market, and everybody else that kind of decided that verification wasn't that important. They just wanted to have one guy. They're getting acquired. So, yeah.
You got it. And
Yeah.
one other thing, talking about the dance between one of the questions from the audience is, what kind of soft skills are needed to manage such a wide variety of companies at the same time? Because you've got the fab company, you probably have an OSAT in there, maybe you've got IP suppliers, and you got EDA concerns. I mean, so what kind of soft skills does the silicon manager or the people going through this process really need to have beyond their technical chops?
I think that you need to have a good ticket system set up. that all the parties that need to collaborate have access to. So the person that drives that needs to be the kind of person that doesn't feel that driving tickets and doing like project management type of work is somehow beneath them or something. That happens a lot with engineering managers, I've noticed. So you need to have somebody that will take on the project manager role with with a serious effort. You need to have somebody that can communicate concisely with all the different parties, and also can determine that you don't need to be an expert in everything. Nobody can be, right? But you need to know enough to know who are the stakeholders for this project that you're working on that need to be involved, so that they are signing off on the phases and they are providing you the inputs, and also so that you can weigh everybody's inputs depending upon, like, okay, if the firmware guy for whatever reason is telling me that the package is not right, I'm probably not going to give a lot of value to his input. But if the mechanical engineer is telling me that the package is not right, well, I'm going to give a lot more value because he knows what the enclosure looks like. So you need to have enough knowledge to do that. And then in terms of piecing together, if you're going deep and you're going to like be managing CAD and things like that, which that might be too deep. But basically you need to have people that have domain expertise in those areas, and then a strong project manager that has enough domain expertise to be able to engage that expert on your side. But you always need to have somebody on your side that's loyal to the system company, looking at all these different suppliers and doing the choosing and then driving them with the ticket system, and then the review slides and the kind of collateral that you need to deliver to them. Like out of this process, you get a requirements document that you deliver to the supplier and things like that. So you need to have that kind of it's a little bit hard to find that type of person, because you need to have communications, attention to detail, and then also be technical enough to be able to handle all that. But there are people, so it really depends how the project looks like. I have got a chip design background, so I'm always biased towards, I manage all the chip design stuff, and then the packaging stuff, I always have an expert. But if you're a packaging guy, you might do it different.
Great. Okay, thank you.
Okay. In terms of spec, the final sign off here is a spec document. So after you've gone through this phase, you've done a lot of negotiation back and forth between your team and the supplier, because you had the requirements document you gave them, and now they're going to give you a data sheet, and that data sheet becomes the law. After that data sheet is approved, your requirements are out the window, that document then is abrogated. So there's going to be during this phase, a lot of horse trading. And once you get out of this phase, you're into the development cycle. And you notice that I have overlapping on the phases, because usually your design starts even as you're negotiating spec. So during this phase, the chip company is going to be designing your chip, and you don't want to burden them with coming over to you or visiting you. So you go to them, you go on a design review. And in those design reviews, they're going to be showing you, you're going to be doing detailed schematic review. You're going to be doing detailed verification, test review and model reviews, verification model reviews. You're going to be going deep to understand that and make sure that they're doing everything that they're supposed to be doing. But also you want to feed them your use cases as a system, so that they're verifying the chip in the ways that you're going to use it. And you want to make sure that all your engineers that are key for this understand how this design works inside and out. So you'll have firmware sessions, you'll have, obviously the analog guys in there, you'll have the digital guys. So you want to make sure your engineers cozy up with their engineers. You also don't want to distract them so much. So you go to their site for 3 days, 2 times, and you just go through everything that you can possibly cover in 3 days. And you do it 2 times. And then towards the end of that phase, you end up with receiving all the collateral. So you'll be receiving the verification reports for the DV, for the AMS, analog simulation, the spec compliance matrix, and you'll basically be checking that they've verified every datasheet parameter is being simulated, 2 corners or whatever, is sensible. And then also you'll be checking, the chips are different. So if you have a lot of digital, you might be checking more, random verification or some other things. And you'll have your experts looking at all that collateral. So they're not just giving you stuff and you're just believing it. You're actually looking and checking it. It might be that you need to fly out to sit down with their verification guys to go over everything, whatever you need to do. But basically, they need to know that you'll be keeping an eye on on everything that's happening, and you'll be actively signing off on the tape out or not signing off. So once the chip is out, you're basically waiting for the validation phase to start. Validation phase is really chip comes back, and now you're going to have a ATE bring up and bench validation bring up, and you'll want to talk to them about the kind of validation plan that they'll be going over. You'll want to try to, as a system company, you want to try to use their resource as much as possible. So if you can offload as much as possible the component verification to the supplier, and they can give you detailed reports, that's the best way of doing it. And that way you can avoid duplicating effort when you get the chips and start checking, because you always have to check. So if they can give you the reports, and then you can then try to integrate and focus your energy on system level validation, relying on the data and the detailed data that they're going to be providing you. That's the best. And through this validation phase, you might be getting bugs. So you want to make sure that you got ECOs that are detailed, that you're going to review. Every change is going to be verified. You want to make sure that the change makes sense. So if it's an analog change, you want to look at the schematic change that's proposed and the simulations and the root cause. Did they really root cause the issue? Or whatever it may be, packaging issue or whatever else. You want to have your expert in that domain review and make sure that it really is root cause and you're not going to have the same issue on the next, revision.
A question from the audience: is there a plan B? What happens, if this starts going south, that you can't get this when it's been promised or when you need it? I mean, what's your recovery?
Well, I mean, once you're on this path, your recovery plan is you gotta make these guys do what they said they're gonna do. I mean, like, you really have no plan B, because if you try to design a discrete backup plan, you're diluting your system team. So now your guys are busy because they're writing software for this custom chip version of the system, and then this other one that's discrete component, and the man hours that you'll spend on that, it'll be a lot, and you'll dilute your team's attention. So that's why I said, like, at the silicon review, that's your make it or break it point, really, because if you make the wrong choice, you're going to start having all these other issues that are less recoverable. So it depends, like what the contracts say. At that point, if you start getting into a legal battle, then everything is lost at that point. So maybe at that point, if you see that you're going to get into a legal battle, you might want to go discrete design again. But yeah, I mean, like, there's not a lot of ways to recover because you've already committed to this thing working. So there's no plan B. There's, like, really no plan B. I mean, like, at least no plan B that you can ship on the same date, unless you multiply a resource on the system side, which nobody will, right? I mean, you're going to focus your energy as much as possible. Any other questions on this one?
Question when you get back to the overall schedule again on the next slide, I think.
Oh, okay. So, and then on this phase, what's really important to exit the phase is that all the bench validation, all the ATE, all the validation of the chip has been completed. And on the system side, ideally, you want to make sure that you've had one build at least. And so you've been able to really wring out any bugs and any issues with this chip, so that when you exit this validation phase, which is usually combined with either the MP phase, which is the next one, or the tape out phase, because you got to fix some things, that you can tape out knowing that you already know what are the bugs that you need to fix, and that the silicon is not going to have any more unknown bugs. So here we're at the mass production phase.
Okay. So could you back up a good question from the audience on the overall schedule? Where does packaging really need to be started, and where does it really need to be finalized?
Well, so packaging is actually part of the tape out sign off process. Well, even at Spec, right? At Spec, you need to have the data sheet needs to have the package that you want, and then at tape out, you would do a check on. Let me get back up. There's a package simulation, so you would do like warpage and thermal sims, and you would give them So you would give them some sort of stack up of your board files, and so that they can do some thermal sims and they can simulate, well, if Usually the hard cases are like you're charging and you have headroom voltage on the charger and that thing generates a hotspot. What's that going to do? What's it going to heat up around it? And can your enclosure dissipate? So that's when you do that before tape out. But you would be working on that, especially if you know that you have a really tight thermal design. You'd be working on that since spec. Like that would be probably part of your sign up for spec, because your thermal impedance would have to be acceptable to your mechanical engineers, so that they know they can design a heat sink that works.
Good, thank you.
Sorry, I skipped that deliverable on the table, but yeah, it's definitely very important. Packaging issue is actually one of the most deadly issues I've faced. On mass production, you're basically at this stage, you have a design that you think is ready to be released to production in terms of silicon. And so the supplier has done all their due diligence, all their validation, the JET qual has done everything. And then on your system side, you've done all your system rel, you've done all your builds, your firmware is working, you've done all your testing, whatever your rack testing is, stress testing. And so you're basically saying, yep, this chip's good to go. And you put together all the validation phase collateral, and you provide that to your executive team. Part of that is usually let me go here, actually, the risk release. So it depends on your schedule, but one of the things that can happen if you have a really short schedule is that the typical ramp up time for wafers is about 4 months. And so if your volume is really high and your DVT to PVT space is not that, timeline is very short, they might actually have to ramp the wafers before you're done with your DVT. So then that becomes a careful negotiation between, obviously, the commercial guys need to talk about who pays for what and when. And that also is something that you need to track. Like, you release a certain amount of wafers, and then you need to, like assume some OTP or something, or you try to like avoid packaging the chips as long as you can. And then eventually you have to freeze, like if you have OTP, you have to freeze it, which is my recommendation usually, because if you're doing programming in metal, then that means that you have to commit to a certain configuration at the beginning of the risk release, instead of like being able to hold wafers and then package and OTP program stuff. So it takes away your flexibility. So it increases your risk here. But it depends. Like if your product release cycle between DVT and PVT is longer than 4 months, then you don't really have to get into this risk release, kind of like commercial discussion. But it's certainly something that comes up, and it could be a lot of money. So you need to make sure that you've got that understood, how many millions of dollars you're going to be risking to be able to ramp on the date that you want. And yeah, so this is the final stage of the process. And once this is cross-functionally signed off, people can, release the data sheet, and the supplier basically at this point, you're just, it becomes a sustaining kind of activity. You might be looking for early field failures, and if you see any, or you might be working with the quality team on DPPM issues that might be coming up. And sometimes those DPPM issues might be as simple as just calibration. You can try to like feedback information from your factory to the chip supplier so they can adjust their trimming and offset maybe some of if you have a difference in IR drop between your system board and whatever they're assuming for their trim. So you can do loops like that, but it should be pretty minor stuff that happens after MP sign off. And then sometimes there's a weapon. It's called the out of bounds review. So every time you do each one of these phase sign-offs, you're getting everybody to commit. So you're getting the whole list of stakeholders, and they're all signing off, like putting their name that, yep, this spec is good for me, or whatever the phase may be. And inevitably, there's always going to be somebody that wants to, scope creep starts coming up. Somebody wants to change this because at the previous company that they did it this way, and he just got hired and he wants to change it because he wants to change, to show everybody he knows more. So then, and if that really creates a problem for the program, you basically just say, well, no problem. We can do that. We need to put together an out of bounds. So you need to put together justification, and we're going to go to the execs, and we're going to tell them why you want to delay the program by 3 months. that's the way, because you don't want to have a process that has no way to adjust, but you also don't want it to be so flexible that anybody can change anything, and there's no sign off required, no cross-functional agreement required. So these out of bounds basically that way, just if there really is some good reason why, you put it all together and you present it and they commit from schedule and cost or whatever it is that you need to do, and you give them the new picture, and that becomes the new way. But it's super critical to have this in the toolbox, because otherwise it can really get out of control. Yeah, and I have a slide on the silicon proposal review, which is what we review at the very, very beginning. And in this review, basically, you just want to make sure that you understand every single delta between the IP they have today and what you're asking, and who's going to be designing it. So it's really important. It's a face-to-face meeting, and you want to make sure that you get to meet the people that are going to work on your program, and you get to ask them questions directly, so you get a feel for how competent they are. And then, of course, the schedule and price estimate, and line-by-line response to requirements with a technical and schedule risk assigned to it, so that also you get visibility, because there might be some things that you might think are easy, but they're actually really hard, and they're the ones that are driving your schedule or your risk or your cost for something. And so you want to make sure that the supplier has the opportunity to tell you which items are the pain points, so that you can go back and think about that and see if you really need that. Then you also need to have that plan to unblock the firmware team. It might be an analog chip, so then you don't care. But if it's something that actually needs firmware, you need to have a plan, like where an FPGA dev board or something is part of the deal. And then obviously you need to make sure that your methodology, DV and AMS, is really well reviewed, and you'll probably want to see some test bench and some sample test code, so that you can figure out if these guys really know what they're doing or not.
Cool.
Yep, that's all I had.
Okay, let's see if there's any more. I think we've covered a few questions. Let's see if there's any more questions from the audience. Oh, and just to clarify, AMS is analog mixed signal. You've used that a few times.
Yes, yeah, analog mixed signal.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Wow, everybody online is an expert, and we must have covered all their questions, or when they said, when they heard, oh well, the packaging has to be done when you do the sign, the initial proposal, then they said, okay, then all that follows, it's easy, right? Or something like that.
Yeah, packaging is tough.
Yeah, it's I think the challenge of all this is keeping all the gears of the different teams in sync, and then not getting the risk ahead. If one part of the development gets far ahead of everything else, then there could be a risk to the overall system. And so keeping all the pieces on track is one of the really important skills. Okay, doesn't look like there's any open questions. So Raul, I thank you very much. I'm sure people can get a hold of you and ask follow-up questions. Let me switch over here. Let's put this back up on my screen. So thank you again. I want to remind everybody, we're going to take the month of August off, and September 9th, we'll have the next Semiconductor Industry Speaker Series. Will be Brandon Pryor, Prismark Partners, talking about the packaging market. Oh, and my apologies. Let me throw the poll up. So if everybody online could just take a minute to give Raul some feedback. I just launched the poll, so please take a minute and do that. And that's about it. So I want to wish everybody a great day, and thank you very much, Raul. So I'll leave the webinar up for a few more minutes so people can do the poll. But I want to thank you again, and everybody wish you a great day. Thank you, Raul.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for the time.